Today I'm going to talk about the theater itself and how understanding a little bit about the theater itself is really going to help explain what's going on in the plays. So, first of all, the Restoration, which is the year 1660, refers to Charles II returning to the throne. He was invited by Parliament to come back between 1640 and 1660. England was enmeshed in a horrible civil war, and it was the royalists who defended Charles I on one side, and then the Puritans who were in favor of Oliver Cromwell on the other side. And there are all kinds of reasons for this war that I won't go into, but I want to talk about how important it was for theater, because during these 20 years, during their Commonwealth period, when Charles I was actually beheaded in 1649. And so, but before that, he had been held captive for a while, and it was really considered a Commonwealth period, or some people call it an interregnum, which is the period between the rule of Charles I and Charles II. And so, basically, England was a republic, so there was no monarch. So Cromwell's administration did not like theater, and they closed theaters and they made theater illegal. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there wasn't any theater, because whenever there's people, there's theater. And so people had clandestine theater. There's a good book on it called Winter Fruit, which is all about all the productions during this period. They took place in people's homes, they took place in taverns, but theater was technically illegal, and so there weren't large-scale professional productions going on. So 1660 is an important year for theater, because the theater comes back and it's rebuilt. And Charles II has been living abroad. He's been in France, he's been in the Netherlands. Particularly from his time in France, he loved the theater there and really believed that a great nation would have a great theater. So he was committed to rebuilding the theater. So the theater in 1660 was really very different. So just a little word about why the Puritans didn't like theater. So there were definitely religious reasons for not wanting theater to take place, and some committed Christians thought that theater was a waste of time. And that sounds kind of trivial until you think about this idea of working toward your salvation, and things that are not that don't contribute to that are actually take you off that path. And certainly, you even find that argument in Daniel Defoe later on, where he talks about briefly about theater as a waste of time, as something that will distract you from your salvation. So it's certainly true that they thought that theater was immoral, and that also immoral things happened at the theater. But there was another issue too for Cromwell's government, which is that any place where there's a public gathering, it has the potential for an insurrection. And that was actually true under Charles as well, although he really liked theater, and theater was somewhat under the control of the crown. Charles also sometimes would order all the coffee houses closed, because he was worried about people plotting. And so part of what was thought to happen at theater was, in particular, royalists would get together and plot. And then in the coffee houses, it was considered that the anti-royalists maybe were plotting. So it's not just theater itself that is necessarily the problem for the Puritans. It had to do with as a gathering space, and a place where all kinds of different people could anonymously meet, and it was a commercial public space, and so it did have some dangers. But the theater that reemerged in 1660 was a different kind of theater than the one you saw with Shakespeare. It was a smaller theater. It was more expensive, we understand, so it was somewhat of a more elite audience, although scholars really disagree about how elite the audience was and how mixed it was. But it was certainly more elite than Shakespeare's audience, which had room pretty much for everyone. So they added a lot of wonderful things in the Restoration Theater that are actually still essential to theater right now. For example, as I know you've heard from your Shakespeare courses, in Shakespeare's time, there really wasn't much in the way of scenery. And so one innovation of the Restoration Theater was movable scenery, which was kind of these tracks they made at the bottom of the stage where you could bring a scene painted in the back. You could pull it out and you could push it back in. So you could be in Rome and then you were in Athens, Rome, Athens, Rome, Athens. So you could pull it back and forth and put your characters in a different city. Another addition of the Restoration stage was more of an emphasis on costume. And so a lot of the costumes actually that were used in the Restoration were clothes that were cast off clothing of actual aristocrats. And so they would donate their beautiful gowns and wonderful outfits to the theater, and the actors wore them. And in fact, there was a law on the books that actors were not allowed to wear their costumes outside of the stage because they looked so great. They wanted to just like wear them around. But it's kind of interesting because it suggests that how incredibly valuable these clothes were. First of all, textiles were very expensive in the 17th century and highly valued. Also because it would create a kind of status confusion because actors were not the elite people who they portrayed, but if they walked out of the theater in their clothing, they might think they were. So there were a lot of things that were added to the theater that were a kind of what scholars have described as a sensual experience. So the visual was particularly enhanced. Scenery, costume, all kinds of costume. And then also there was much more music in the theater. There were musical interludes, there was singing, there was a lot of music that took place throughout the evening in introduction of women onto the stage. So as you know from your Shakespeare courses, in Shakespeare's time, all of the parts were played by males. The female parts, Cleopatra was played by a young, they called them boy actors because they tended to be younger men who specialized in these roles. And some of them were actually still around and retrained to play male roles. So there are some examples of particular actors such as Edward Kynaston, who was apparently a very attractive person and had played females in his younger days, and then upon the Restoration he took up some male roles, and actually he played some female roles too. There was a little bit of overlap, like in the very early time, like in 1660 to maybe 1662 when the theaters first reopened. Some productions still had males in the female roles, but actually Charles II decreed that women should now play women's parts. So this actually created the profession of the professional actress for women and opened it up, and also really changed the whole experience of theater, and also changed the way playwrights wrote plays because they wrote much bigger parts for women, and women were much more important to the plays than they were in earlier plays. So why did this change take place? Well, a lot of people have said that Charles II wanted women on stage because he liked to look at women. And it's certainly true that he liked to look at women, but I think that's really kind of a superficial explanation, because Charles II was surrounded by women. He had many mistresses. They lived at Whitehall with him. They were an important part of the court. when he had children with these women, he often gave aristocratic titles to these illegitimate children. So they became, dukes, and they were given parcels of land, and they were raised into aristocratic status. So Charles had no trouble getting beautiful women into his life. Although I do think that lots of people liked looking at them for, just kind of for purposes of objectification. But there were other reasons too. And I think one important reason why Charles wanted women to be on stage was because the English stage was in many ways modeled after the French stage that he saw when he was in exile in France. And so a stage with women on it, I think he and many of the courtiers thought of as a more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan kind of theater. And they actually looked down on the earlier English theater as crude, as, wonderful in its own way, but not refined and sophisticated and not cosmopolitan. And so he initiated many different changes to the theater. So another way in which the women on stage kind of comes from a more cosmopolitan vision is that it draws from the another genre, which is the court masque. Charles's mother was named Henrietta Maria, and by the way, she is the person after whom the state of Maryland is named, Henrietta Maria. And his mother was French, and she loved putting on these court masks. And so they were incredibly elaborate and expensive. And the key thing is that in the court masque, they weren't just professional performers. They were also people in the court would take on roles within the play. And so there were lots of women acting on stage, and she herself acted on stage in these masks. So this kind of theater that was highly stylized, highly visual, had a lot of music, would often have dancing as well, influenced the kind of theater that emerged in the Restoration. At first, a lot of these women were disparaged because there was still some stigma associated with women being on stage. It was not a respectable profession. Of course, that has stayed with acting for decades, if not centuries. So there were no women who were trained for the stage, of course, because this was not historically a profession open to women. So the first generation of women, and they were somewhat disparaged, but they really kind of learned pretty quickly and quickly became important figures in the culture. And by the 18th century, they're really full-blown celebrities. And acting became a really one of the few ways a woman could make a lot of money, and sometimes more than her male counterparts, although you'd have to be really famous to do that. And certainly some of the plays were written for women to appear to be very sexy, and this was part of it. But playwrights also wrote very serious roles for them, and they actually in roles that expressed their full range of their capacity, which they learned and they studied, and they were they called them nurseries, but which were places for training performers of both sexes. And so there were basically acting schools that emerged, theories of acting, philosophies of acting. It was really, some people call the 18th century an actor's theater. So a few things finally to talk about Restoration theater. They're a little quirky and hard to get used to. First of all, a lot of times there's like a prologue and an epilogue that is very different in tone from the actual play. a character will come out and say something kind of funny that is completely, not in sync with the character that you just saw. And this is kind of typical. And often, there's a famous one where Nell Gwyn, who was an actress who also became the mistress of Charles II, but she was also had lovers who were other actors before Charles II. In fact, the joke was that he was called Charles III because she had two lovers before him who were each named Charles. So she plays in one of Dryden's plays. She plays the role of Saint Catherine, who is a highly virtuous person, and she dies for virtue in the narrative of the play. And so you see her dead on the stage, and then in the epilogue she gets up and says, imagine me dying for virtue, what a ridiculous idea. And it's very funny, and it's very puzzling to modern readers who see this kind of moment of high tragedy, which moves very quickly to comedy, about what's going on there, because the tragedies and the heroic plays pull you into a particular kind of emotion that is really then broken at the end by some comical epilogue. So either it's an emotion that's uncomfortable, that needs to be dispelled, that you can't go home feeling so miserable and contemplative that your spirits have to be lifted at the end. But this was a very popular thing to do. And I think it must have moved the audiences from one emotional state to another. And the other reason I think that they did this is that it's actually consistent with Restoration theater as a whole, which is, I guess we'd say, like, it's immersive in a sensual sense, but there's never any sense that you're not really in the theater. That is, that it's very self-conscious about performance. And so you don't just watch Hamlet, you watch Betterton's Hamlet. Thomas Betterton, a very famous actor in the 17th century. So they were very conscious about who was playing the role. And also, because there weren't that many new plays coming out, audiences would see a play like 4 or 5 times. If it was running, they would keep watching it, and the theater would keep showing it until people stopped coming. But throughout, there's Restoration theater is always kind of a meta theater, constantly, because there's always a constant awareness or reminder of the fact that it's a performance. So there's never any real attempt to kind of persuade you it's not performance. Like, it's not realism. Don't ever confuse it with realism. They would not have confused it with realism. If you go into it thinking it's realism, you'll be very, very confused, because all kinds of things happen that are not at all consistent with realism. So they're always like very very self-conscious about performance, and the audiences were very self-conscious about it too, and they distinguished the actors, and they would go see a play because they thought their favorite actor was in it, and so this kind of big switch between a very sad play and a comical ending with an epilogue is consistent with a larger sense in Restoration theater, that the goal is not to persuade the audience that this is a real living room and you're just peeking in. There's always a great self-consciousness about performance. So another thing that's often said about Restoration plays is that they're much more modern than Shakespeare plays. There's a kind of big, leap in kind of toward modernity, and that they're and I think this has to do with a lot of things that I mentioned before, a kind of scenery, costume, women. They also had special effects. They had trapdoors, they had wires where characters would fly around, and a lot of other kind of things for entertaining people. Um, so so performers actually specialized in certain kinds of roles. So you would get used to, certain actors would always play the lover, others would always play the fop. Certain women would often play the evil, powerful queen, as we see in, Dryden's plays, but it comes up again in many times throughout the period. And there's an intense focus on the performers themselves, and the text is just really a small part of what happens in the theater. So this is all part of a royal vision of a certain kind of stage, which is both sophisticated and cosmopolitan, and that the language is supposed to be highly refined. So there isn't any attempt, as you know, if you've read any of these plays, there isn't really an attempt to capture the way people actually talk, which is sometimes the goal of contemporary theater. The goal is to create the most elegant, witty, refined, even poetic, and many of the tragedies are written in poetry, not in prose, to capture a kind of really, really elevated language, or clever and witty language. And so finally, just a word about some of the serious plays. I'm going to say, so a lot of these plays were set in distant locations. So they were cosmopolitan in two respects. They were cosmopolitan in the sense that they were aiming to be refined and sophisticated, which kind of meant to the elites, like the French, and polished, and following the classical unities of time, place, and action. But they were also cosmopolitan in the sense that they expressed great curiosity about the rest of the world. And while this became a sort of a stream in Renaissance theater, in Shakespeare's time, in earlier plays, a lot of them were set in distant locations. This just becomes a flood in the Restoration period. There's a fascination with, what does China look like? What does India look like? What does the New World look like? And clearly, English people were incredibly curious about what was going on in the rest of the world, greatly fascinated with a kind of global perspective. And you can really see this in the theater, because this is the place where actually you see it the most powerfully. And when novels emerge in the end of the Restoration and early 18th century, they tend to be more focused on the domestic, I think. But the theater is a place where English people explored the rest of the world. And so I like to think of the stage at this time as a kind of portal through which people look to kind of think about what is the place of the English in the world, what does the rest of the world look like, and how do we all fit into the global